Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace, Post Media Saskatchewan's video podcast from the legislature, of which I'm not in. I am Murray Mandryk. I'm political columnist for the Regina Leader Post and Saskatoon Star Phoenix, huddled in my basement, but I will soon be joining my colleagues at the legislature. With me today, as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, political reporter for the Leader Post and Star Phoenix, and joining us, Adam Hunter, Saskatchewan's political correspondent for CBC. Hi, guys.
Henry, Arthur.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Good. Let's start with the update as quickly as we can. I'll start with you, Arthur. We have kind of new rules related to vaccinations because it's not just on chronological order anymore, although maybe a little confusion as to what that really means. And we have new restrictions that are moving province-wide. Can you give a quick rundown, please?
Yeah, so with a few, notable exceptions, the Regina rules have expanded elsewhere. We now have your bubbles have essentially been popped, everyone. So welcome to Regina. We've got you're just limited to your immediate household, and further, we're going to see churches and other places of worship limited to I believe 30% or a certain capacity limit or 30 people. And but what we're not seeing is the restaurant restrictions that have been in effect here in Regina since the third wave really started to take hold of the province. And we're also only seeing recommendations with regards to travel in certain other areas like Moose Jaw that are really seeing a major surge in variant cases. This comes as the SHA is warning doctors that, a pretty wide swath of the province, pretty much everywhere below the boreal forest, is facing risk of uncontrolled transmission. It's really not limited to the south anymore, though that does remain the epicenter.
And Adam, the solution for government to all this has been vaccinations and getting as many vaccines in the arms of as many Saskatchewan adults as possible. I believe the goal is every adult in Saskatchewan at least signed up for a vaccination by mid-May, although some interpret it mean everybody getting a vaccine by mid-May. Problem being is a couple of things that I think the government is trying to address this week in terms of prioritization in terms of vaccines, but generally just not having enough vaccines to get everybody as quickly there as possible. Can you speak to what they're doing, changing the vaccines, and why that goal of having most everybody vaccinated in a month or so or in line for a vaccination is still a pretty long shot in terms of something that the government can accomplish?
Yeah, the Health Minister, Paul Merriman, was asked about this yesterday in the news conference, if that goal was still realistic. He said it was. It was based on the supply they're expecting over the next number of weeks. And I think the one big thing that I would point to for what people should keep an eye on is where these are changing as far as the age goes, how fast they're dropping down. So this is different in different parts of the province, as we know. In Regina, it's almost going down a year a day in the drive-through, and that, of course, started because Regina was the epicenter, was the headquarters for variants of concern, and that's why the government changed its strategy. They've been moving on to other, first responders, police in Regina first before, other parts of the province. So Regina could get down to that adult population in a month quicker than other parts of the province who are having to stick to that age guideline, to also, the problems with AstraZeneca being approved for all ages. That has slowed down a little bit. And we just heard from the Premier a little while ago on a news conference with other premiers, Premier Ford, Kenny, and Higgs, on nuclear reactors. And he was asked about vaccines, and he said that, they're going to run out by the end of this week. He wasn't being literal, I don't think, but he said that, they're getting quite low. And again, stressed the need for vaccine shipments to come to Saskatchewan quicker. As we know, this has been a big boast for the government, is that Saskatchewan is among, if not the top, day after day in percentage of doses given out, and near the top in the percent of population that's received at least one dose. So they're saying we're turning these vaccines out as quickly as possible. We need more But to get you back to your question, Murray, it's going to depend on where we are in the province. I think Regina, possibly Saskatoon, could see those age numbers dropping. And we also heard from Dr. Shahab, who said, the chances of getting your second dose sooner really depend on the uptake of people, all adults, taking that first dose as soon as possible.
I'm going to stick with you for 30 seconds, Adam, to get a little bit more clarity, because one of the issues that people seem confused by is what exactly Dr. Shahab said. Some people are interpreting it as Dr. Shahab saying outright everybody will get their first vaccination before anybody can get their second. I don't believe that's exactly what he said. I think he's been relatively consistent in terms of saying that that it's a goal for everyone to get a shot in the arm before everyone gets their second. But explain why even that is problematic. Why, given the fact that our maximum best day, I think, was 13,000. I think yesterday we were back down to about 6,000 vaccinations. Why it would be difficult to then hit that mid-May target, given the fact that that requires at least 10,000 vaccinations a day, just mathematically speaking. And I guess maybe why that might not even be the best strategy, because obviously they're moving a little bit away from that, Adam, in relation to aiming at police officers, pharmacists, firefighters, and weirdly, not weirdly, but interestingly, people that work with pharmacists, like people in Costco's that might be clerks that have where there's pharmacies and they might have access in Costco and Safeway and Superstore and Walmart to those vaccines, which is what a lot of people want because of concern about frontline worker exposure, but very specific frontline workers. So let's talk about that, starting with the problem with the vaccine numbers and why maybe it makes more sense to aim the vaccines more pointedly, so to speak, at specific arms.
Yeah, this has been a debate for at least the last month on where to target the vaccines, not necessarily in the hotspots like Regina, but where it should go to. And everyone seems to have a different example of who a frontline worker or an essential worker is. We saw this, as you mentioned, with police and fire and other first responders. You mentioned the pharmacies, which won't come into effect until April 26th or so. So that's a little ways away. But there's other groups that have come forward this week saying that they should be deemed essential and be put in priority lines, things like teachers, daycare workers, a wider range of people who work in healthcare, work with people who have disabilities. Also, you see other immune-compromised people who haven't been deemed ready for a shot yet, according to the guidelines. We saw pregnant women have been added, 16 and 17-year-old immune-compromised have been added. So they are changing almost by the day or every couple of days on this. But the target for that mid-May would need, as you said, Maria, 10,000-ish a day. If we drop below that, if there's a problem in vaccine supply, which we know isn't always the most certain, then they're going to drop below that goal. But I think the one thing that people need to keep an eye on is how often they're changing, where they're going with the vaccine, and if they're targeting these hotspots like they have been in Regina. And yesterday, last night, in fact, Saskatoon getting the warning from the SHA that variants of concern are in the community and people need to take extra precautions. But as you mentioned, bars and restaurants and other places aren't under the same restrictions that they are here in Regina.
Arthur, why are they not moving that way? What's the explanation given for not extending at least the bars and restaurants limitations to take out only to other hotspot areas like Saskatoon and Moose Jaw, etc., if they're going to be extending province-wide restrictions? There's been a significant reaction to that. And I guess that further, is it possibly because they do and are compensating Regina restaurants a little bit for the cost of the closures, and that they extend that to the entire province? That would be a substantial hit to the provincial budget. Are you hearing that, and are you hearing significant amount of frustration with, I guess, from both sides, but specifically from the side of wondering what is the point of extending household bubbles, or limiting household bubbles to your immediate family if we are going to have schools open in other provinces, if we are still going to have bars and restaurants open? That seems to be the common refrain I'm getting from elsewhere in the province.
I'm not sure that we have heard an entirely clear answer about that, Murray. I mean, we've heard the health minister say repeatedly that the situation is stabilizing here in Regina. You'd think that that in itself would be evidence that the kind of measures that have been put in place here in a wholesale way would be necessary to achieve the same kinds of results and at least get a handle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
on the growth that we're starting to see elsewhere. And that seems to me to be especially the case because we still don't entirely know what's driving the upsurge in cases in terms of the location of exposure. I mean, they've definitely highlighted both households and businesses, workplaces as being partly responsible, but we still don't have complete enough data to really know how much each one of those is contributing, right? So it does seem odd to me. It may well be something that they'll be forced to move on in the coming weeks. That being said, schools, we have continued to hear from provincial officials and even from some school board representatives that though they continue to see cases, most of them do come from outside of the school environment. So that seems to be part of the reason why the provincial government continues to leave it up to individual school divisions to make decisions about whether they want to go to full online learning or not.
Adam, is that a situation where they're leaving it up to school boards just simply because they can, and they want the school boards to bear the heat, I guess, from a decision that's kind of difficult for households to make, because having your kids at home, if they're smaller kids, generally means that you have to make other arrangements in terms of your own work life, and not everybody, of course, is working from home. A year after, it just seems odd that this would continue to be the issue in play, and that we can't seem to get a reasoned solution to how to be nimble and maybe not lock down, but actually be able to live by restrictions that we were living by a year ago and that we somehow have seemed to have forgotten. Everybody kind of forgets that it was on, I think, April 23rd last year that the Premier made his address to start lifting restrictions in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, I think the one thing yesterday that came up, and it was a good question from Mark Smith from CTV, who said, on March 9th, when the government loosened restrictions, and since then, there's been almost double the number of increasing cases pretty substantially across the province. And we've obviously seen other parts of the province other than Regina be hit with these variants. And Minister Merriman said that the variants have thrown a curveball, that they were making a decision based on the best information they had in front of them. But if that's the case, then, as Arthur mentioned, Saskatoon isn't getting the same restrictions that Regina did at that time, a couple of weeks later when they did reverse those restrictions in Regina. So I think, hearing from the public that, the messaging is always an issue. It's, is everyone being treated the same way at the same time? Are we getting all the information in a timely manner? What are we basing our decisions on? And once again, Dr. Shahab and the minister yesterday, or Dr. Shahab and Premier Moe, when they're together, are they saying the same thing? Are they messaging the same thing to the people? And quite frequently, the messaging from the government in the House to the media is about vaccines. It's about vaccinations. It's not as much about lockdowns or restrictions or measures. They will say time and time again that the measures are significant in Saskatchewan. I heard today Premier Moe said these are the most significant health measures across Canada that he can remember, and that he knows that people are getting tired of it, but that the vaccines are the issue, and that's the way through this, and that's what we've all heard from the media. That's what the public's heard, and I think going forward, people need to remember that the government has always said this is about hospital capacity, that is the number one point onto when they make restrictions in Regina. The reason that they came down so hard in Regina when they did is because the hospital capacity was being strained. The ICUs were over capacity, over 100% capacity. They even miscounted the amount of patients in the ICUs because they were in other wards. And that hasn't happened in other parts of the province. Not to say that other hospitals aren't strained or there isn't concerns. We definitely hear that from health frontline workers in Saskatoon. I saw Dr. Shaw come out and say, people should stay home yesterday. So I think that is, you know, the number one thing that I would say to people to keep in mind, that when they're concerned or confused about the restrictions or what the government's messaging, remember that they've always said it's about preserving hospital capacity, not necessarily about preventing cases or preventing spread. So I think that's one point I would make about what the government's saying when they say it. They're always looking at those hospitalization numbers, those ICU numbers.
It's interesting to me, Arthur, because this is what a lot of people are talking about. This is certainly what we're hearing from Minister Merriman and Dr. Shahab every day about, or at least when they speak. It's what the opposition is drilling down now that the House is back sitting and they have question periods. It's what they're directing at the Premier on a daily basis, and he's at least somewhat being forced to account for that in question period. However, this is clearly not his favorite subject matter. In matter of fact, since I think his last today's Wednesday, and since his last press conference related to COVID, which was a week ago, the day after the budget, I think he's had 3 other events that have been totally about something else other than COVID. He's talked to oil executives. He's talked to U.S. Republicans about Keystone XL. And today he talked about small modular reactors that you covered. Tell me what he's saying about these other issues and maybe why he is talking about other things than COVID. Is it specifically because there's a lot of other things going on that needs to be said right now, or is it a situation where they're trying to, from what you're observing, keep a separate line of communication with anybody other than the Premier talking about COVID right now?
Well, it seems that even when he's forced to talk about COVID, it's exclusively about vaccines. I mean, even in question period, when the opposition has been focusing on this with about, the overwhelming majority of their questioning, virtually every answer from the Premier is about how well we're doing on vaccines and how we need to stick it to COVID by getting vaccines. So it's clear that that's where he wants to keep the focus. And in terms of the other events, I mean, he got into a little bit of trouble in one of them at the CAP event in Alberta for, as he put it, blue skying about the vaccine delivery plan when things were very much up in the air and further confusing the messaging. So it hasn't really been a successful communication strategy from the Premier, I think, over the past couple weeks, and really when we are in a critical time about getting this third wave under control and overcoming vaccine hesitancy. That being said, he's been very consistent about vaccine hesitancy and trying to fight that as a major threat to the provincial vaccine rollout. He said himself, get whatever vaccine comes to you, they're all safe for your age group, and he himself would gladly get the AstraZeneca vaccine if it were offered to him. I believe Dr. Shahab also recently got the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is very good news for him. I guess that he'll be able to get back to what I'm sure is his partying ways in the near future.
Rolled up his cardigan and got his vaccination. Just before I leave you, go back to Adam. The small modular reactor was an MOU signing today with my understanding with other premiers. It seemed an odd bit of timing though. Is this getting to be an increasing strategy for all premiers to basically talk about something other than COVID? And I get why they'd want to, but I don't know if that's necessarily what the public necessarily wants to hear right now, since small nuclear reactors aren't going to be coming tomorrow. Just briefly, Arthur, what was the announcement, and was it really all that pressing in your mind?
No, it wasn't pressing, because the earliest one of these reactors is going to be built in 2028, and even that is contingent, and it's going to be in Ontario. We're getting our first SMR, God willing, in 2032. So no, this could have been done at any time. It's certainly to be done now. That being said, even though it was an event geared toward this revolutionary technology, which is good news and which is very promising, the premiers were still forced to spend the entirety of their question and answer session responding to questions about vaccines. The premier was able to pivot back to the exciting energy news that he had to share with us, and I'm very interested in nuclear energy, so I was happy to hear about that. But I'm sure that the public is a little bit more hungry to hear from their leaders about the vaccine rollout and about the risks and restrictions. And they've been mainly getting that, as you said, Murray, from the health minister and not from the premier.
What about it, Adam? Is the worst case of COVID fatigue in Saskatchewan belonging to Scott Moe right now? Because it does seem that there is a strategy here for him not to talk about it. Now, maybe that would be a smart thing if we're seeing a strategy that's consistent in rolling out and people not having questions to answer. But when so much is policy-based and when it's ultimately the premier responsible for policy, and you're getting questions emerging from the press conferences and on a daily basis as to what our vaccine strategy is, et cetera, is it really a smart idea to basically for a premier to be talking about anything or trying to talk about anything other than COVID and then being pulled back into the COVID conversation every available opportunity when oppositions or reporters or whomever have legitimate questions to ask?
I think Friday was a good example of this because we did have question period on Friday afternoon, and we were in the room there, and Premier Moe came in and he addressed right away the high case numbers that day that were higher than they had been, 350 plus. We hadn't seen the news release yet, and he said, hopefully you'll see this right away. And he seemed to, almost preview what we got yesterday as to what people should expect, that there probably were going to be more restrictions or, a fanning out of restrictions, let's say, across the province due to the continued high numbers. I don't think getting answers from the premier, like I haven't an issue with him answering any questions or ducking questions.
He's good with us. He really is.
Yeah. And so just so the public knows, but people were asking yesterday, why is he meeting with these U.S. congressional leaders about Keystone XL, which was canceled in January by President Biden, at the same time as we're expecting, more restrictions in the province. I think that's a fair question, scheduling conflicts or whatever. And obviously the premier has to govern and work, on all issues at all times. It's not specifically COVID, but getting back to what Arthur said about the SMR news conference today, it was Premier Ford, Premier Higgs of New Brunswick, Premier Kenney, and Premier Moe, and all of them got exclusively COVID-19 questions from national media, vaccine questions, and specifically it was aimed towards the Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan premiers, where the cases are higher, the per capita cases are higher, and there's more concern about variants and hospitals being overrun, where the New Brunswick Premier Higgs didn't need to address all of those. He did address questions on vaccine hesitancy, about AstraZeneca, vaccine, getting the vaccine supply. But these questions are going to continue whether any of the premiers want to talk about them or not. Anytime they come in front of a microphone or they're in front of the media, they're going to be asked about COVID, as they have been for the last year, whether the cases were high or not. So I think those questions are going to continue every day in the House since it's been started for more than a week. The opposition has led with COVID-related questions, which we didn't necessarily see in December or last spring. So I think that's definitely a sign of where we're at in the pandemic, and COVID fatigue or not, these questions are going to continue, and people are going to want to know when they're up for their vaccine. And I should mention the premier's 47 in Regina. The drive-through as of today is 48. So he's going to get a vaccine, I would assume, very soon. And I should mention, last check, every MLA who has been eligible for a vaccine, according to the government and the opposition, has got one or has an appointment. And I know a lot of the MLAs who are Saskatoon or out of town based, like Greg Ottenbreit in Yorkton, they all got the AstraZeneca through the drive-through because that's what they were offered at the time. So that has changed in recent days with Pfizer going into the drive-through in Regina. But just to get back to Arthur's point about what vaccines being offered, the government's putting their money where their mouth is. They are getting the vaccine when it's available, and it's going to all the MLAs who are age eligible. That might bother some people because the certain frontline workers haven't got it yet, but that's the policy, and the government is definitely following it with the elected MLAs at this point.
I guess you can't blame the premier for wanting to escape today's COVID world into something else. Fortunately, it's all the time we have for today. I thank you guys both. Covered a lot of ground. There's so much to talk about, seemingly on a weekly basis. Adam Hunter, CBC, thank you so much. Arthur White-Crummey, thank you as usual. And we'll see you next time on the podcast. See you guys.